Good day, dear friends.
Hey, Mikhail and Leonid. Thanks for attending our club lectoria on this Friday evening. We appreciate your presence. Today, I would like to introduce you to an expert who is an economist, a well-known economist, and also the head of the consulting company called Neocon. His name is Mikhail Leonidovich Khazin, who will have a discussion with us, with everyone, about the role, status, quantity, past, present, and future of the dollar. The dollar as the national currency of the USA, the dollar as reserve currencies, global reserve currencies. Why are we talking about this today? Well, it would be funny if in Russia they celebrated the birthday of some money bill, but nevertheless, the dollar as an equivalent, as an indicator of the state of the economy, is very important. You need to understand all the processes that take place in the global economy and in the Russian economy are somehow connected to the dollar financial system in the world. There are different opinions. The dollar is at a crossroads of opinions, with some predicting a very inglorious and swift demise, while some economists say that the dollar is stable, will occupy a leading position in the global financial system, and not everything is so bad. Only the quotes differ on a daily basis, depending on the specific circumstances that are currently prevailing at the present moment in time. Here's the whole shebang of these questions. I hope you'll ask your questions today that concern our esteemed guest, Mikhail Leonidovich Khazin. Now I'll give him the floor. Let's start the lecture on the role of the dollar in the global economy.
Expressing my gratitude, well, in actuality, I'm deeply thankful. I truly appreciate your kindness. Actually, they asked me to start by telling the story of the dollar. I'll tell you a bit about the history, and then we'll talk about the role, because this role emerged from history in many ways. And I will commence with a particular general economic factor that we will be considering to an increasing degree as we continue to progress further and further in our journey. What is the main purpose of banks, and why are they essential in our financial system? You can talk a lot about how banks accelerate economic development. In all econ textbooks, on the first pages, there is an example of two companies, one of which grows on loans while the other on its own profits. The one that develops on credits develops faster. They are needed because it's a business for their owners. There's something else going on there. Then you can suggest various conspiracy theories, which of course everyone does, that there is some kind of global conspiracy of bankers. Not that you could not say that. There is no conspiracy, but it is more of a coincidence of interests rather than premeditated actions. The lack of a deliberate plan implies that the alignment of interests is fortuitous rather than orchestrated in advance. However, there is also an economic rationale for the objective necessity of banks, which started in the 16th to 17th century and has remained relevant due to factors and advancements in the financial domain. The fact is, the contemporary economic model that we refer to as scientific and technological progress in the present day, it actually originated and developed in the 16th and 17th centuries in Western Europe, specifically in countries such as England, France, and the Netherlands. The reasons for its appearance are different. I believe it's a complex combination of the financial crisis of the 16th century, linked to the importation of a colossal amount of gold from Latin America, which was discovered at the very end of the 15th century. I believe that in 1492, Columbus discovered America and the so-called Little Ice Age, a local minimum of climate that made normal farming impossible in Northern Europe, also played a role. The financial crisis of the 16th century, the importation of a large amount of gold from Latin America, and the Little Ice Age are all factors contributing to its appearance. We are aware of this story from the very end of the 16th century. At the beginning of the 17th century, during the reign of Boris Godunov. It was a time when there was no harvest in the country for 3 years due to the cold weather. And at this point in time, I will not dwell on this particular subject because it will consume a significant amount of time. Allow us to have a discussion regarding the fact that a wholly separate technological model emerged during the 16th century, which called for the development of new and innovative ideas and approaches in order to meet the requirements of the time. Even during the early 17th century, approximately between 1605 to 1607, there existed individuals like Antonio Serra who wrote and provided descriptions of this economic model. In his writings, Serra emphasized that to ascertain the relative wealth of the two cities, one should consider the multitude of professions held by their respective residents, as it serves as an indicator of prosperity and affluence within each city. The greater the number of professions, the wealthier the city. In contemporary economic terminology, the more extensive the level of division of labor in the economic system, the greater the value added generated by this system. An entirely comprehensible and inherently logical conclusion that is completely natural and easy to understand. Therefore, in essence, it was already evident right from the outset of the 17th century that the economy that materialized was an economy characterized by the deepening and division of labor, or as Serra would put it, an augmentation in the quantity of job opportunities. Well, there is one problem that is not very clear in terms of what actions should be taken to address and resolve it. The fact of the matter is, when the division of labor is deepened, it leads to an escalation of risks for the producer. In the case of a small town with a wagon master, if he does not encounter any issues whatsoever when it comes to selling his products, then he can carry out his business smoothly without facing any difficulties. He's making it for her on demand. Yeah, sure, lightning can hit the customer's house, it can burn down, yeah, sure, it can get struck, but those are still rare events, extremely unlikely. And he basically has no economic risks if he is involved in the production of wheels for vehicles. For the cart business, the masters in the neighboring village who assemble ready-made carts from parts are already having problems because he can't control whether this cart business master will sell wheels to some other person from another village. If he produces wooden spokes for wheels and transports them to the fair biannually, in both spring and autumn, in large quantities, possibly even 2 whole bunches, then he is truly undertaking a significant risk, as there is a chance that upon his arrival at the fair, he will discover that carts with metal wheels and metal spokes are already being sold. And that is the conclusion. And subsequently, he does not have any chance whatsoever to obtain a refund of his money. Well, naturally, what is this division of labor thing? This is an increase in the number of operations from raw materials to the final product. This means that the person who is somewhere in the middle of this chain, they have both the beginning of this chain and the end somewhere lost, and they absolutely cannot make any conclusions about what will happen in 6 months, in a year. He is still able to operate with his previous experience, but life does not remain stagnant, So here's the thing, the risks are increasing. And in this situation, the emergence of banks is that they take on some of the risks that the producer has by lending to him even before he has made the product, that is, purchased the components and everything else there, and even before he has sold them, thus providing financial support throughout the production process, which helps to mitigate the uncertainties and challenges faced by the producer in the early stages of production. This is a mechanism for risk redistribution. Simultaneously, naturally, there exists an issue, namely that as the specialization of tasks intensifies, the greater these risks become, the more financial institutions are compelled to assume, the more challenging it becomes for them to do so, difficulties arise. Let's make a note that this thing was comprehended rather swiftly after Antonio Serra by Adam Smith in the latter part of the 18th century, specifically in the second half of the 18th century. Who was the person who authored that if there exists a closed economic system, then it is, and what is the identity of the author who was accountable for composing it?
Do we possess it? Oh, Adam Smith, the year 1790 is the year when it was first mentioned.
In this closed system, the level of division of labor gradually increases up to a certain point, and then it comes to a halt. Beyond that point, no further increase in the division of labor is observed, indicating a limit to its growth within the system. According to my statement, it signifies that the banking system is incapable of taking on any further risks, leading to a cessation of economic development. Due to the impossibility of deepening the division of labor any further, the risks associated with it are deemed too great. Therefore, when giving credit to an inventor, the collective returns are not obtained, as the number of unsuccessful projects becomes excessively large. At that moment, out of nowhere, based on Adam Smith's concept, in a closed system, the expansion of specialization only increases until a specific threshold, which is determined by the system's size. The bigger the system, the deeper the level of division of labor becomes. There are two immediate conclusions. One natural. If we have a closed system and we have reached this maximum level of division of labor, then in order to keep growing, we need to expand in size or scale. So the conclusion is that starting somewhere from the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, the world should represent these large systems of division of labor, which we call technological zones, that expand as much as possible. And when they can no longer expand, they start competing. And that's when a crisis begins in them. And the second output is philosophical in nature. This is because the earth is finite, which means that the deepening of the division of labor, also known as scientific and technological progress, as a mechanism of development, is inherently limited and constrained by this fact of finite resources and capabilities. In my opinion, Karl Marx, who is also visible on the screen, and who in terms of his education was not an economist at all, but rather a lawyer and philosopher, could not pass by this moment without studying the works of Adam Smith, a renowned economist and one of the most influential figures in the field. And due to this reason, he initiated the development of a theory regarding a post-capitalist world, because he believed that the deepening of division of labor, scientific and technological progress were intrinsically connected to capitalism. If this system is finite, then capitalism will ultimately end, and something will inevitably come after capitalism. And a theory was invented, which he called in the economic part, just like Adam Smith, political economy, but at the same time, philosophy was developing. At the same time, a comprehensive historical concept was invented, historical materialism, that is, in fact, for the first time in the history of mankind, a systemic concept was invented that describes the entire social life of humanity. Without a doubt, there were gaps within it, there were multiple questions, and another noteworthy aspect, but the methodology utilized allowed us to formulate such comprehensive and overarching conclusions. V, it is the right time to make the switch to the dollar currency without any further delay or hesitation. Given that capitalists did not genuinely embrace the notion of the conclusion of capitalism, they devised alternative concepts as a result of that rationale, and in order to address that concern and mitigate the potential impact of such an outcome. The sociology of Weber was invented, and the concepts of history were invented by Weber himself. In the present day, we are able to perceive all of these concepts that exist today and are still relevant in our modern world. For example, in the idea that Stalin and Hitler were two completely identical totalitarian dictators who fought against the free world. Well, and all that heavy nonsense. And as an alternative to political economy, another one was devised and brought into existence. The field of study known as economics, consequently, individuals who follow it are referred to as economists. So, since this is an ideological alternative to political economy, and since one of the fundamental concepts in political economy is the ultimate end of capitalism, then in economism there is no ultimate end of capitalism. This subject is considered taboo. For this particular reason, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that what was once an abstraction for both Adam Smith and Karl Marx, namely the unified system of labor division, has now become a tangible reality in today's world we live in. Today, the whole planet is like one big system of labor division with the United States of America at its center. That is the reason why scientific and technological progress as a mechanism of development eventually comes to an end. However, economists are unable to provide a comprehensive description of it. What we observe is that the entire field of modern economics, starting from the IMF and the World Bank, and encompassing renowned institutions such as Harvard, Chicago, and other universities, is incapable of explaining the complex dynamics and phenomena occurring in the global economy. Not due to their lack of intelligence, but because in their specific terminology, this particular topic is regarded as a taboo subject. He who must not be named. That is precisely the accurate representation. So here's the matter. This is of utmost significance because I'm going to refer to it frequently in the future for important purposes. Now let's return to Adam Smith. Almost at the same time as the passing of Adam Smith, one of the colonies of the British Empire, which had already established a technological zone, declares its independence, marking a significant moment in history. Now here's something that is truly of utmost importance to say. Britain was incredibly gung-ho and extremely enthusiastic about its pivotal role as a technological hub. In the colonies of Britain, it was against the law to engage in technological production. This prohibition was enforced by the legal system, my friend. If you want to make a factory, plant, workshop, or something else, please head over to the islands, to the British ones. In every single additional area, it was absolutely and without exception, strictly and unequivocally forbidden and not allowed under any circumstances whatsoever. It is absolutely forbidden as it constitutes a criminal offense and is strictly prohibited by law. And that's why it's only natural that one of the colonies decided to break away. However, once she managed to escape, she was faced with the task of establishing her own financial system from scratch. During that particular time period, there was a model which had already been established in England of the central bank that was in existence. Back then, it was still a semi-state, half-assed education. And as expected, I'm going to do a little bit of snooping right now because I don't remember the dates. In 1781, like 2 or maybe 3 years after the USA was formed, they went ahead and created the North American Bank, which ended up becoming the central bank and all that jazz. However, it quickly became clear that it's not very clear what it exists for. At that time in the United States of America, money consisted of gold and silver coins. And in that sense, the central banks printed money. In Britain, they printed paper money, but the banks didn't control it. The banks were independent structures, so there was no point in it, and that's why it was closed. However, even back then, in Britain, there was this remarkable person, Nathan Mayer Rothschild, who played a crucial role and closely monitored what was happening in different places. He really wanted to take control of the newly emerging financial system of the United States of America. There are no personal emotions involved, purely business considerations. In order to achieve this, he utilized the services of his agent, Alexander Hamilton. The years of his life were chronicled during his tenure as the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, one could say from the very beginning, which, accordingly, led to the implementation of his patron's plans and objectives for the nation's financial system. As a side note, it is worth mentioning that he is depicted on the $10 bill that was in this particular place. And the first American bank was created in the year 1791. This bank achieved remarkable success and performed exceptionally well, exceeding all expectations. He began providing loans to the government, which naturally utilized that money, resulting in a highly significant inflationary impact. Throughout the course of the past 5 years, prices in the country have experienced a surge of over 70%. As a result, there was a strong movement to close this bank, with Rothschild from London wagging his finger, but nothing came of it. In 1811, the license for the first bank was revoked, not renewed. That is, it was issued for 20 years and then terminated. London did not appreciate that at all, and it seems like a complete coincidence that, after a span of 4 months, Britain declared war on the United States of America, which happened to occur 4 months later. Well, not very successfully, because simultaneously she was involved in a conflict with Napoleon while trying to handle other challenges. In 1915, the war in Europe came to an end, and Rothschild was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. In 1816, a precise replica of the first bank, referred to as the second bank, emerged, making it an exact copy of the original institution. And in accordance with the usual practice, bankers were not too enthusiastic about parting with their own money, so that is the reason why the authorized capital was set up in such a manner. The government contributed its share to the authorized capital, after which the bank issued loans to bankers. They invested this money in the authorized capital, and so on several times until this bank was formally filled. So this all continued to go on. The rate of inflation was on the rise, and there was no economic justification for the existence of this second bank. In the year 1828, Andrew Jackson, a former general, was born into this world. He would go on to become the 7th President of the United States, serving in that role with distinction and leaving a lasting impact on the nation's history. In light of the considerable public dissatisfaction with the second bank, its leader Nicholas Biddle put forth a proposal to Congress 4 years prior to the expiration of the license, suggesting an extension of another 20 years in order to address the concerns raised by the public. This was done correctly in President Jackson's election campaign. He served as president on 2 occasions. The concept was that he would not have enough time for that, and the legislation on license extension would be able to be prolonged. So nonetheless, Jackson fought back, and then an incredible and inspiring story began to unfold. Upon initiating his second term in 1833, Jackson promptly instructed the Secretary of the Treasury to withdraw the funds from the accounts of the Second Bank of the United States. All of the money was hidden in this bank. Nevertheless, the Minister of Finance declined to execute this task and was promptly terminated. The subsequent minister executed the same action. Thus, right after they appointed him and provided him with the task of withdrawing the funds, he declined to perform it. And it was only the 3rd finance minister who, literally within a span of a couple of months, ultimately accomplished the president's assignment. And then a highly unusual crisis commenced. The central bank deliberately triggered a state of paralysis. This is actually the second bank in question. Caused a credit market paralysis, sharply reducing the money supply. The outcome of this event was a crash in the financial markets, deflation, and a profound depression. However, there were still innocent times back then, so they recalled that the head of this very bank had stated prior to the commencement of this undertaking, "We will present this to Jackson." They brought it all to the surface. Jackson fought against it, and the impeachment they attempted to declare did not pass. They did not renew the bank's license, and the Senate formed a commission to investigate the bank's activities and gather information about its operations. Biddle didn't show up at the commission meeting, and he also refused to show the bank's financial documents, which is why he was arrested and convicted, but it's the honest truth. The ultimate strike in this war was the assassination attempt on President Jackson. The assassin was firing with 2 firearms simultaneously, but failed to hit the target. And then, for a period of roughly 25 years, the American financial system thrived and operated successfully without the presence of a central bank, demonstrating its resilience and ability to function independently. There were both gold and silver coins in circulation. In addition, people relied on banknotes issued by specific individual banks as a widely accepted form of money and means of exchange. That was the preferred method for banks to generate profits because, in theory, they could print a greater quantity of banknotes than they had the ability to back up with reserves. In addition, there was this incredible place called the Wild West, and a whole bunch of people who read about Henry or those other books about the Wild West were running off there with all the money from their own banks, just like bankers, and it was truly astonishing to witness the extent of their actions and the impact it had on the region. Or maybe they didn't even avoid it, but simply took and transferred it to their office in some remote place where depositors couldn't reach and take their money, which they were ready to give them. The Civil War commenced in 1861. The war began in the first year. and it was revealed that the industrially developed North was facing a shortage of funds, while the South had a surplus of wealth and resources at its disposal. The southern region was in fact wealthier than the northern region during that period of time. And that's where the new President of the United States of America, Abraham Lincoln, made a revolution. He started printing Federal Treasury banknotes. In order to distinguish them from banknotes, they were printed on paper with a green backside. And due to this reason, they obtained the poetic designation greenbacks. The income generation system for banks was completely destroyed as a result, leading to a severe impact on their financial stability and operations, causing substantial losses and jeopardizing the overall health of the banking industry. President Lincoln, as we know, was assassinated. I wouldn't be surprised if that's exactly the case. Subsequently, within a remarkably short period of merely 6 months, greenbacks were completely withdrawn from circulation and ceased to be issued, thereby no longer being a part of the currency system. By the way, that is a truly intriguing picture. The Northerners came very close to losing the Civil War because England and France were fully ready to join it on the side of the South. It is worth noting the potential consequences of such an alliance on the ultimate outcome of the war. And it was solely the intervention of Alexander II and Bismarck who declared that the entry of England and France into the war in the Southern Territory would automatically result in the entry of Germany and Russia into the war in the Northern Territory that ultimately put an end to it. In other words, the existence of today's United States of America can be attributed to the crucial role played by Russia in this significant historical event. There were a multitude of different stories. In the year 1873, the American Congress, at the behest of lobbyist Ernst Sade, made the decision to demonetize silver, which caused a real shitstorm and sparked widespread controversy and outrage among the public and financial experts alike. It's mighty interesting, the letter from the head of the U.S. Banking Association, Buell, the contents of which unfortunately became known much later. In this 1877 letter, there were words like these, for example, from diverse association members. Repeating the trick with the government printing its own money, similar to Lincoln, can provide people with money, which will seriously undermine our revenue base, like bankers and creditors, and have a detrimental impact on our financial stability and long-term economic prospects. In the year 1881, the President of the United States of America was elected as James Garfield, who previously served as the head honcho of the Banking Committee in the Congress. In this specific post, he apparently figured out how the financial system works, and in one of his speeches immediately after the inauguration, he explicitly stated the following words: "The one who controls the country's money supply is the absolute ruler of its industry and trade." When you realize how the economic system is controlled by influential individuals, you won't need anyone to explain where the causes of economic depression and inflation originate from. A few weeks later, President Garfield was assassinated. Moving on. By the conclusion of the 19th century, the United States of America had successfully created their own zone of technology, marking it as the third in history, a significant achievement for the nation. The initial one is British, the second one is German. At that particular moment, it became clear and apparent that the currency of the United States of America, namely the dollar, is one of several global currencies, including the British pound and the German mark. At the onset of the 20th century, a distinct technological zone came into existence, known as the Japanese one, yet it remained on the outskirts due to its considerable distance from the main centers of activity. The story of the American society's conflict with bankers persisted. In the early 20th century, President William McKinley in 1900 initiated anti-monopoly probes into a financial institution owned by J.P. Morgan. Presenting John Pierpont Morgan, widely recognized as the preeminent American financier and renowned for his immense influence in the financial world. On one hand, in the past he worked as an agent for the Rothschilds, providing loans to the northern government during the Civil War. On the other hand, he gradually gained control of the banking sector through his strategic maneuvers and influence. And as a result, at the beginning of the 20th century, President William McKinley sparked anti-monopoly investigations into one of his institutions. The people gave their support to it. President McKinley emerged as the winner of the election that took place at the end of 1900 and was re-elected for a new term. However, tragically, he was assassinated in 1901, bringing an untimely end to his presidency. The investigation obviously was closed. And then a very interesting thing started, which I kind of mentioned at the very beginning. At the beginning of the 20th century, the level of division of labor in the United States of America, well, like in those markets they controlled, reached its limit. Banks were no longer able to lend to the manufacturer in a proper manner due to certain constraints. If they gave him a loan taking into account all the risks, then the interest rate turned out to be too high. Entrepreneurs didn't take these money on credit. And what about the banks? The banks simply cannot decline to provide funds on credit, particularly in the earlier days when derivatives did not exist, thereby necessitating their agreement to the interest rates that were prevalent in the market at that time. They were positioned below the risks that were taking place, and as a result, the banks commenced experiencing acute liquidity problems. What do banks do when they have liquidity problems? They start borrowing from each other. And in 1907, in the good old United States of America, there was an extremely fierce crisis, especially in the banks, with all that interbank lending stuff going on and causing significant turmoil. The problem was successfully solved by the mentioned J.P. Morgan, who gathered all the big bankers in 1908. During the gathering, they conducted a mutual offset to address the issue, with Morgan taking the initiative to invest the missing money. It was at that moment when it became abundantly clear that the existing system needed to be changed in some way or another to prevent such problems from arising again in the future. In November 1910, there was a secret meeting at Morgan's estate on Jekyll Island. Among the participants were families like the Morgans, Rockefellers, Kunos, Lobys, Goldmans, Mellons, Zacks, DuPonts, and others. They even hired a European financier named Paul Warburg as a lobbyist. At this here meeting, super top secret, and that's important, we'll see it a little later, a decision was made about the need to create an institute that would take on some of the risks of the banking system. So if financial institutions assume the risks of producers, then this particular institution should have assumed the risks of banks by refinancing the automated banking system. In the year 1913, this law was passed, and there were problems there as well because many senators had a hunch that something fishy was going on. I will refrain from delving into all the intricate details and complexities that you can explore, for instance, in the book titled Twilight of the Gods, authored by Sergei Egisyants. It is identical to Games of Satanists. It is accessible on the internet for anyone to view. And accordingly, in 1913, at the last meeting of the Senate, when some senators had already scattered for vacation, a law on the Federal Reserve was adopted. In just about 6 months, it will be the centenary in the Federal Reserve System of the USA. She initiated her acting career in 1914. This allowed for an extra resource, deepening the division of labor and enhancing productivity within the industry. In 1914, as we know, the First World War commenced in the fall, with the essence being that 3 technological zones, namely British, German, and American, initiated a fierce battle for markets, marking the beginning of a long and devastating conflict that would shape the course of history. During that time, the Russian Empire, in terms of its economy, was considered to be a part of the German technological zone, which had significant influence in the region. The objective is to extract the Russian Empire from the alliance with Germany and bring them into the alliance with the Entente powers. That was an exceptionally fascinating operation, a highly complex endeavor. She was created in the kingdom of Alexander III, during the period when Witte facilitated the entry of British capital into the territory of the Russian Empire through France. But I won't discuss that now because we're discussing the dollar. The Federal Reserve Act was passed during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. As you can clearly see, nobody assassinated Woodrow Wilson, who served as the President of the United States on 2 separate occasions in America, during which he held office twice. And an extremely important thing, the Federal Reserve System of the United States, is an organization with a complex structure. A total of 12 backup banks can be found in that area, with their management being represented by private capital. In other words, these structures are privately owned and operated by individuals or private entities. There are central governing bodies of the Federal Reserve, the Open Market Committee, which, if memory serves me right, consists of 12 people, 5 of whom are appointed by the President, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve System, his deputy, and someone else, while 7 people represent reserve banks in a complex coordination. So in other words, the role of the government in managing the Federal Reserve is less than 50%. This is a privately owned establishment that is not open to the public, with a complex management structure. Naturally, the fact that she is located in Washington has its influence, but I will provide you with more information about that at a later point. The United States of America experienced a period of prosperous development until the end of the 1920s due to the creation of the Federal Reserve System and the victory in the First World War. These 2 factors played a significant role in driving the economic success of the nation during this time. The fact is, it was exactly at that time, in the late 1920s, due to this system of refinancing, that banks, for the very first time in history, started to provide loans to consumers rather than producers. Yes, that is correct. However, there are only 2 operations involved in this process. Starting from the 1920s, they initiated the practice of extending credit to land speculators, referring to those individuals who would purchase land on credit and later sell it for a profit, and individuals who engage in speculation in the securities market. As a consequence, 2 financial bubbles experienced growth in the United States of America during the 1920s. In the land market, not real estate, but land, and in the stock market, not real assets, but stocks and shares. The land market bubble burst in 1927, and on the stock market in the fall of 29, but that hasn't caused an economic crisis yet. By the spring of the 30th year, the stock market had managed to recover 50% of the decline it had experienced during the fall of the 29th year. And at that point in time, a crisis of deflation started. And at that time, due to the presence of a gold standard, the Federal Reserve System of the United States of America refrained from printing dollars in order to maintain the stability of the currency. As a result, the crisis followed a typical deflationary scenario. Demand dropped, factories closed, and the overall decline amounted to around 35% of GDP. Percent MVP. And there was nothing that could be done because the credit-driven private demand was so much greater than the government's, that all attempts by the government to somehow increase it, which President Herbert Hoover of the United States of America did not lead to anything good. There was no effect, because all the budgetary possibilities of the state were 2-3% of GDP, and the decline rates were 1% of GDP per month. That is, about 12% per year. Amid a 12% decline, the 2 to 3% from the government made no difference. By the way, Herbert Hoover is well known even in our country. He was a very well-known American engineer and public figure. In the year 1920 or 1921, he was in charge of the ARA, which is an abbreviation for the Commission for Supporting the Starving in the Volga region, or he paid a visit to our country on one occasion. As we can see, he lived a very long life. He lived for 90 years, yeah. And overall, he was a real positive dude in American history. It is evident due to the fact that a crisis occurred during his tenure, resulting in the Great Depression. For an extended period, he was regarded as an extremely poor president. And only after the majority of the Great Depression's victims had passed away in the 70s, comprehensive research demonstrated that, despite the absolute appropriateness of his policies, he was generally unable to take any further action. In the year 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt assumed the presidency of the United States of America. He followed the same strategies as Herbert Hoover, but he also implemented numerous fascinating legislations in the field of economics. First and foremost, he declared a default by diminishing the gold content of dollars with his decree. Secondly, he carried out a reform for the confiscation of gold, thereby implementing measures to reduce the amount of gold in circulation. The terms confiscation reform sound relevant today after Cyprus, but God knows they actually started a long time ago in the past. The reform of confiscation meant that the citizens of the United States of America had to surrender all of their gold at a fixed price set by the government, which was 2 to 3 times lower than the price in the market. Folks, turn in your currency. That's about the United States of America in the early 30s. Someone thought that Bulgakov was writing about us. Nothing of the sort. And there was one more wonderful thing that even Comrade Stalin himself didn't come up with in his brilliant inventions. So you can imagine how amazing it was. And in the USA, specifically the United States of America, since the year 1933, citizens were not allowed to open their own safe deposit boxes in banks without the presence of a tax inspector, an official designated to enforce tax regulations and ensure compliance with the law. This is democracy. This is freedom and democracy. That is how it is supposed to be, you know, right? Here you go. There have been a multitude of various stories on this particular topic in this specific location. We went to court with the demand to repeal some of Roosevelt's laws and declare him guilty in order to challenge their validity and seek justice for the affected individuals. A number of laws were repealed, but they were unable to condemn Roosevelt because the Supreme Court devised a brilliant and decisive formulation, which proved to be a game changer. The situation can be likened to this. Yes, he committed a legal infraction, but given the lack of any alternative course of action, he is unable to elude or circumvent it. Yeah, the situation is extremely necessary. After that, I analyze everything myself. I do not require any additional hints. By the conclusion of the 1930s, there were already 5 technological zones established in different parts of the world. The British, German, and American economies started to recover, while the Japanese and the USSR emerged as technological powerhouses in their respective regions. And it became apparent that they were running out of space. There was a severe crisis in Japan, Germany, Britain, and the United States of America, with limited room for expansion. The Great Depression, the Second World War, has begun. After the end of World War II, out of the 5 technological zones and systems of division of labor, only 2 remained in order to continue developing: Soviet and Western powers. We completely destroyed and divided the German and Japanese ones, while the British one became a fully integrated part of the American one. And this occurred prior to the conclusion of World War II. This took place in the year 1940, and it also happened in 1941. Who observed the film Casablanca? It is mentioned in this location according to what was stated in the movie. Well, isn't that something? You must know the classics. Who saw Black Cat, White Cat? Nobody watched it either. There, one of the characters continuously keeps saying the final line from the movie Casablanca, non-stop. This is where a strong male friendship begins. So you see, it mentions that in 1941 in Casablanca, Churchill and Roosevelt met. And Churchill, in exchange for military aid, especially destroyers, allowed the United States of America to trade with British colonies, bypassing London. The British system of division of labor has come to an end. That's it. Britain joined the United States of America. After that, there was a real boom in the economy. Things started taking off like crazy. I'll tell you a little bit about it later. And it continued in the USSR until the beginning of the 60s. When Khrushchev was accepting the new party program at the 21st Congress and stating that communism would be achieved within a span of 20 years, he was expressing his views with complete honesty. Because the growth rates we had from 1945 to 1960 were truly unbelievable. If we extend them for 20 more years at this growth rate, we would truly have communism. But the problem was that we also had scientific and technological progress. And by the beginning of the 60s, we reached a level where we couldn't develop any further. We had a socialist system, we had a planned economy, so the crisis emerged when the growth rates started to decline and show signs of slowing down. The bosses comprehended this, so there was an initial endeavor with the Kosygin reform, and subsequently with the Khrushchev reform, and then again with the Kosygin reform implemented by the government. However, because the basic foundations remained unchanged, it had no discernible effect or impact as anticipated. Now here's the thing, we gotta say something really important. Unlike economism, in political economy, the topic of the end of capitalism is not taboo. Adam Smith's concept of enlarging markets, that is, the necessity to bring down the United States of America, could be conceived. But the problem was that at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, in Marxist political economy, this topic was developed by Rosa Luxemburg, who somewhere around the 5th or 8th year had a heated argument with Vladimir Lenin. Lenin debunked her economic conclusions, as a result of which this entire topic of the dependence of economic growth rates on the scale of the system, initially proposed by Adam Smith, was considered taboo in the USSR and no longer openly discussed or acknowledged by the Soviet authorities. And that is the reason why the corresponding theory was only invented in the late 1990s, early 2000s, by our contemporary Oleg Vadimovich Grigoriev. So the thing is, the crisis initially started, but it kind of kept going, the growth rates were sort of falling continuously over time. In the good old United States of America, some elements of the crisis have started to show up too. In the early 1960s, despite the apparent stability, the upcoming President of the United States made a decision to emulate Lincoln by initiating the printing of banknotes from the Treasury instead of the Federal Reserve. Consequently, he faced a comparable outcome to that of Lincoln, experiencing similar consequences from his choice. The sole distinction was that he was not killed using a handgun, but rather with a long-range precision rifle known as a sniper rifle. And then in 1971, during the reign, apparently, of the last great American president, Richard Nixon, something truly terrible and devastating happened that had long-lasting consequences for the nation. Shit's hitting the fan. In 1971, on August 15th, Richard Nixon declares a default of the United States of America in the 2nd and 20th centuries. He is completely rejecting the gold content of the dollar. It is becoming evident that the content of gold in the dollar cannot function any longer. From an economic standpoint, this means that the banking system and the Federal Reserve have exhausted their ability to take on the risks of producers. The crisis is impending. I will give you a little information about him later. Stay tuned for more details coming soon. Now, I gotta say, at this moment, there was a clear feeling that the United States of America lost the competition between two systems. Because in the United States of America, there is a decline, while in the USSR, there is still growth. And at that moment, the USSR theoretically could have pushed for a victory. And if the theory that Rosa Luxemburg started to compose and then Oleg Grigoriev had already existed, then the USSR should have been pressing the USA in the main directions. Enhance the ideological confrontation, tighten the budgetary matters of the United States, and correspondingly, intensify the problems associated with the ongoing oil crisis that the country is currently facing, grappling with, and trying to find solutions for. Instead, the USSR went the complete opposite way. He started mass sales of oil on the global markets right at the beginning of the 70s. In 73, Samotlor went live. He signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty with Nixon in 1971, which took the burden off the American budget. At that time, it was even more of a burden on the American budget. I even recall that in 1972 in Moscow, there were several buildings that were destroyed, and these buildings still haven't been constructed. Empty lots in honor of Nixon's visit. Here's the lot where the new exit from Mayakovskaya metro station is now. An old two-story house stood there, but it was later demolished. The house was situated on the continuation of Frunze Street. That's the slope between the Kremlin and the Pashkov house. There's this really green little lawn there now, but before there used to be a few old houses standing there. They were destroyed during the visit of Nixon, and accordingly, in the year 1975, we signed the final act of the conference in Helsinki, in which we recognized the concept of human rights in the Western countries. And she's still meowing to this day. Here, you see, this is already economics. The average salary chart in the United States, unfortunately, has shifted a little bit. The little red one, it needs to be moved down so that it starts at the minimum, of this chart. The actual average salary in the United States of America, it is evident that there has been a noticeable growth and expansion of markets as the risks for the producer have decreased due to the expansion of markets. Prior to the 70s, then there is this crisis, then there is this growth linked to ergonomics. Yet, this growth is mainly because Americans have begun changing the methods of calculating inflation. If you don't do this and calculate inflation using the methods from the 70s, you end up with a red curve that shows that real average wages continue to decline. If you draw this graph for households, the picture will be even more beautiful. There's this red line, which represents the honest income of households. It starts from some minimum in the 80s and goes horizontally. The disparity between household income and average salary is linked to the fact that the average number of individuals employed in an American family has increased over time. In the 1980s, there were 1.2 individuals, indicating that 1 in every 5 married women were employed. Currently, it is 1.5, signifying that every alternate married woman is employed. However, it is important to note that this minimum wage corresponds to the purchasing power of the early 1960s, which means it reflects the economic conditions and cost of living during that time period. The current average salary of Americans, taking inflation into consideration in terms of purchasing power, corresponds to the early 1960s in terms of its value. So the next move, given a 10-year period to consider their options, the Americans devised a plan of action. Just so you know, the problem is related to the economy. The risks involved are too significant. You can't deepen the division of labor. The banking system can't finance producers. What options are available here? Option 1, to expand, as Adam Smith taught us. No way, because everything that could be captured has been captured. And in other places of the USSR, they are great and awful. So there's only one option left. This is a way to reduce the risks for the producer by increasing consumption. In the late 70s, Paul Volcker, the head of the Federal Reserve and the Carter administration, developed a new economic program. But unfortunately, Carter, or fortunately, it doesn't matter, Carter was not re-elected for a second term, and this program was implemented by the US President Ronald Reagan, which is why it got the name Reagan. The primary factor driving the economy is financing, particularly through consumer lending activities. And here we come across some idiotic situation. Because if you give a person money on credit for 3 years, of course in the first year he will increase his consumption, but after 3 years it will fall.